Hello, I'm Dena Shottenkirk from talkPOPc. Thank you so much for coming here to Brooklyn College and talking about First Amendment issues. This is really wonderful that you're doing this. So please introduce yourselves.
My name is Ben Wizner. I am a lawyer at the American Civil Liberties Union, have been for more than 20 years, and based here in New York.
Great, wonderful. And you are?
I'm Alex Abdo. I'm a lawyer at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University and a former colleague of Ben's at the ACLU.
Oh, that's great, that's great. So we have two lawyers.
That's right.
You're stuck with
and
two
one
lawyers.
philosopher.
For better or for worse.
That's great, that's
Yeah.
wonderful, actually. All right, so, we sort of started this event here, right? It was a sort of faculty-driven initiative to ask talkPOPc to come here and to sort of revisit our project on censorship. So what we do, this is a very topic-driven project. So we develop a topic. I actually do a whole body of artwork about it and a book about it. And then we just open up our tent and we ask other people, so what do you think about it? So it's a way of kind of building consensus and getting other people's viewpoint on a particular topic. So the censorship topic, as you know, right, since it's your professions, is particularly pertinent to everybody right now. So our thought was that students, and I think it's not just students, I think it's a larger public, right, have kind of lost sight of what the First Amendment is. So I thought I would just ask you guys, like, tell us about the First Amendment and how does it impact us right now and what should we know, what should we be remembering?
There's so many places to start. One of the real challenges in this conversation is that there are really two concepts that are a part of almost every conversation around free speech. There's the First Amendment, which protects the right of people in this country not to have their voices silenced by the government. Mm-hmm. But there's also a broader commitment to free speech that we have in this country that's not about government censorship, but it's about the right of people to be able to talk and contribute to public discourse. And so often conversations that are labeled, about as being about the First Amendment are really conversations around this cultural commitment to free speech as opposed to the constitutional commitment to free speech. And
can I just interrupt you a
yeah.
second? So I think, I'm going to give it back to you, you tell me if I'm wrong, all right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that in some ways what you've done is like, the First Amendment applies to public spaces. Is that correct?
And it applies to the government in particular.
The government
it applies
in particular,
to government
right.
efforts by the government to censor or distort public discourse.
Okay, but then the other issue that you're talking about, that seems to be a broader issue.
That's right.
Is
yeah.
that right? Okay, can you go there a little bit?
Yeah, so the cultural commitment to free speech, which is what I like to call it, is just about the ethos in this country that people have a right to say what they want to say without being punished in some unreasonable way. And the boundaries of this kind of cultural commitment to free speech are, forever going to be contested, and it's kind of inevitable because there are not courts to interpret the cultural commitment to free speech as there are courts to interpret the constitutional protections for free speech. And so every generation has to decide for itself what its commitment to this free speech principle is going to be. And that's why I think we will see in every generation a renewed fight over the acceptable parameters of public discourse on campus or the acceptable parameters of discourse during elections or in the grocery store. Mm-hmm. I think we're kind of committed to that as a society, and I think that's an opportunity. It's not a bad thing. It's a necessary thing, mm-hmm. and it's the obligation of each generation to do its best to pass on that commitment, and it's the obligation of the upcoming generation to decide for itself what it wants its commitment to free speech to be.
John Stuart Mill made this distinction, and tell me if this is sort of tracks what you're talking about, between government censorship
Mm-hmm.
and social censure.
Yeah.
Right. Is that kind of tracking
that is,
a little bit?
That is, and Mill was even more concerned, I think, with social censure than with official censorship by the government.
Right. He was,
and that's, I think, reflected in popular conversation today, where what most people actually care about is not government censorship, because the government doesn't censor that often, because when it does, organizations like the ACLU can file suit. Mm-hmm. So much more of the conversation is about social censure.
And where it gets even more complicated is that social censure is itself often protected by the First Amendment.
Right.
And so the bogey word that we're not using so far, but that's hanging in the air, is cancellation.
Yes.
Right, cancel culture. What does this mean? And it's a word that sheds a lot more heat than light. But
That's
at its
right.
core, I think what Alex is trying to say is that there is a normative question. At what point do we decide that the social consequences of an error are too severe. And to me, particularly when we're talking about the challenge of being a teenager in a world where everything is recorded forever, and where the things that when you and I were kids were heard and remembered, if at all, by only the people who were immediately around us, but now stamp someone as something for a 15-year-old mistake.
It's very scary.
And it might result in adults then making decisions
About
to
their
say,
job.
you shouldn't come to this college because of something that you did when you were 15, and of course, you will hear angry insistence that we're just holding people accountable. We're responding to speech with more speech, and as a legal matter, that's absolutely true. But I think we still need to decide, as a society, are we okay with this? Are we okay with the severity and permanence of the response, given the sometimes minor scale of the offense?
And what are our options, do you think?
Well, I think one place I would start is instead of wagging our fingers at kids, look adults in the eye and say that it's unacceptable for adults to be assigning lifelong punitive consequences for the mistakes of children, just because a mob might demand it at a particular time. So the adults in the room are the ones who have to say, those of us who believe in restorative justice, those of us who believe in the context of, say, criminal justice, that people are more than the worst thing they've ever done, have to take some of that ethos and sensibility and apply it to the context of offensive speech, even deeply offensive speech, and not assign someone a category for life because of something that they said in a conversation. And again, I think the law isn't going to help us at all in this. This
Are
is
there
really
adults in the room anymore?
Well, I do think that we have seen in the last half year or a year that some of the adults at colleges and universities, private and public, think that things have gotten a little bit out of hand, with students being enabled in shouting down opposing views that they don't agree with, not just protesting them, but essentially deplatforming them.
Sure.
And I think you're sort of starting to see at these schools a recommitment to making tolerance for opposing views a sort of bedrock of university education. It's still hard.
It's very hard. I mean, kind of what our motto always is about listening, right? About listening to others, right? And I kind of am proud in some ways of Brooklyn College. We're the most diverse campus, and we've had relatively little problem. We have a huge population here of Orthodox Jews and a huge population of Muslims. And yet, I think we've been reasonably good about not having too many conflicts, although there have been some. What students have said to me, what they think the problem is that everyone's kind of just hidden back in their entrenched worlds and sort of refuse to have interchanged conversations with other people out of fear of conflict. And that's not great either. So how do we kind of get out of either the craziness of these insane conflicts where we're telling each other to shut up all the time, or the opposite, where you just sort of entrench yourself in your own world where everyone agrees with you?
This is an enormously complicated problem. I don't know that there's one answer. One of the challenges is that people's understanding of the views held by those they disagree with have become so polarized by the spaces in which people typically interact. Because people so often these days interact with the views they disagree with through social media or through things that tend to caricature the other side. And one thing that's great about university campuses is that they are still a place for the physical interaction.
Let's hope.
Where community matters and where the responsibilities that arise organically through being physically close to other people are present. And that's important because so often context is lost online. Context is lost when you have remote interactions with people. Because humans developed over the course of millions of years to figure out how to interact with people in person.
It's absolutely true. I mean,
Yeah.
this is why we do this in person. Evolutionarily, we know how to read each other in person
Yeah.
in ways that we do not online.
There are context cues for this conversation. I can see your eyes, you can
Yeah.
see mine, I can see, the movements of your body.
Tone of voice, God knows what else,
Yeah.
right?
Online,
Yeah.
Facebook has given you a thumbs up, a fiery
Yeah.
face emoji, and a handful of other ways of interacting.
Yeah.
And and that's not it's not a substitute for the complexity of.
Yeah, but I worry. I mean, I worry about, like, when we were setting up here a couple of days ago, I noticed all the students coming in, right? And I noticed everyone's, of course, on their phone, right? And I wondered, are they looking at books? And so I and the intern decided we would do a little investigation, and we walked through the whole library to see if we could find anyone looking at a book, right? And we finally found 2 students, male students, looking at this book on a table. And so then when they walked away, we said, let's go look at that book. And it was Licit and Illicit Drugs. That was the one book that was being looked at in the whole library. And so everyone is just like in there. Like it used to be, you walked into a library, you remember when you were students, and you opened up a book and you fell into another world. It was another person's world that you were being given, right? Now everyone's just in their own world.
I think there's a political problem here too, which is that it used to be that a college campus could be a community of values.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to maintain a community of values in a world where everybody is on social media. And so, you have a set of norms about, say, assuming good faith and good intentions is possible to do if you were at a retreat and everybody's phones were stored in a locker. But where the conversations on campus are being processed through the conversations that are happening on social media, it's really hard for Brooklyn College or even the University of Chicago to say, this is how we're going to be in this community, because the other community is always present, and the consequences of saying something that might be a stray comment in your community now could be having that posted to the entire world.
Right, so there's no private anymore.
I
Right.
mean, there really is, and I think
Yeah.
that one thing that colleges really ought to try to do is establish a set of unenforceable norms that things that are said here will not be posted online. Right? And it's
that's a
small
good idea,
step.
actually.
It's a small step, but it's something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think just to pick up on a point Ben mentioned earlier, which I really resonates with me, is that in some ways a commitment to free speech is a commitment to the possibility of redemption. It's a commitment to
That's
the
a nice way to
possibility
say
of that people might change.
Yeah.
And one other really important element of redemption is the ability of a society to forget. And
Germany has that law, right? Isn't it called the right to
It's very
forget?
hard to legislate.
I'm
Yeah,
not,
yeah.
I'm not convinced that. I think
I'm not convinced either.
I think the
Yeah,
best analysis I've heard of the right to be forgotten came from Professor Jonathan Zittrain, who said it's a terrible solution to a very real problem. And
That's great, yeah.
so I don't know what the right solution to that problem is. I don't think what we have now, which is a machine that never forgets and strips all community interactions of context. I don't think that's the solution. But how you get from where we are to somewhere more productive is very challenging. And it is worth pointing out that communities can also be oppressive culturally in terms of norms, and the internet provided, especially in its early days, a reprieve from the oppressiveness of communities and allowed people to escape.
Oh, that's true. I
and
forgot that.
You're
right.
a weird teenager.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you're in a
You're not
conversation
alone.
with a weird kid in Germany or in Norway or in Japan,
Yeah.
and you're not just with the 300 people in your small town, right? And that, I think it still is an important dissident outlet in that way, and that has to actually be part of the equation. And again, just to build on Alex's point, we've lost the belief that people can change their minds.
Yeah.
And so there's really very little attempt to persuade, and you see advocacy organizations like ours, our speech is all about mobilization and not about persuasion. And that
Could you explain the difference, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not trying to speak to someone who's undecided. I'm trying to fire up the people who already agree with me. That's the difference, right? And I think part of this is that we're all so addicted to measurable data. We're all doing our communication on social media. We can all see the numbers that represent engagement. And if you're hyper-focused on that kind of data, you're going to systematically undervalue things that can't be measured.
Yeah, I think
like
that's
persuasion.
right.
And so, we really have, as a society, lost the belief that anybody's going to change their mind, and just focused on trying to get our side to 51%, or a much smaller number if that's all you need to push on an issue. But people do actually change their minds. People emerge from cults like the Westboro Baptist Church to become thoughtful advocates like Megan Phelps Roper. If you read that piece about her in the New Yorker some years ago, it may not be common, but if you lose your belief in that, then probably you shouldn't be a free speech lawyer.
Yeah, there's some work being done in philosophy now about credences of belief, and I think it's the right way to look at it. It's not like yes or no. We believe in like maybe 0.6%, but then someone talks to us and we respect their opinion, and now our belief has changed. Maybe now it's 0.8, right? So I think that that's the way to look at it, and it has to be looked at very temporally and as part of a dynamic system over time. And I think that, as you guys are pointing out, there has to be sort of underwritten by an attitude of forgiveness. Otherwise, we don't go forward very well.
I remember when I was a teenager, maybe a little older, but arguing with someone who was in the military about my age. Maybe we're in our early 20s. And he was saying, you don't understand the military. We cannot have gays in the military. It would destroy unit morale. We'd be scared. And I was trying to tell him, you could, and we were not getting through to each other. And then I said, let me ask you this way. Think about everybody who was, in your unit. Now imagine that you found out today that one of those people was gay, and you could sort of see the gears moving. And he's like, I would love him just as much.
Yeah.
Right. So it's that way of sort of experientially having,
I think you're right,
your mind open or turn just a little bit is extremely hard when people are walking around even in a library like this.
Yeah.
I also think I was doing a little bit of research before Ben and I came here today, and I saw just the breadth of the artistic work that you do. And one thing that I've always believed, because when you're a lawyer and an advocate in particular, you spend a lot of time thinking through how do you persuade somebody of something? How do you use reason-based arguments to change somebody's mind? And there are limits to the ability to change people's minds if you try to confront them rationally, because a lot of defenses immediately go up in someoe's head when they see a rational argument.
Or in propositional form.
That tries to engage with them in that way. And artists historically have been some of society's first dissidents, and I think in many ways some of the most effective first dissidents, because they don't engage people in the same way, or they often don't. They could, but they often don't. They often engage with them through something of the sort that Ben was just saying, in an experiential way, in a way that tries to shift their frame of reference, or just draw on their empathy.
Empathy is, and belief. I think a lot of times we believe in artworks that then allow us to believe in a larger issue. So I think you're right. It's a form of everyone knows this. This is why Plato didn't want them in the Utopia. This is why Hitler didn't want them. Everyone knows that artists can persuade people about things that arguments couldn't. Although arguments are really important too. What you guys do is really important.
There's a place for technocracy. There's a place for it. I think a movement takes all forms, and I think you need to, if there's a problem, you need to try to use whatever tools at your disposal, including legal arguments or rational arguments. But,
one of the things that legal and philosophical arguments can do in these debates is sort of require people to engage at a level of abstraction, and to put the shoe on the other foot, and say, if you really are justifying this, how can you not justify that? So
to commit.
To commit.
Yeah, I think so too. I always make students bet. I don't actually collect, just so we're clear about this, right? But I always go, I'll bet you $5. And it kind of makes them focus, right, on the issue at hand. And then when they're right or wrong, it's a great method, right? And it makes it goes in their head, like, oh yeah, I was wrong about that. I need to think about it this way. I lost $5, So I think a lot of times the rational argument kind of underlines a passive belief, if you want to say it like that. Could you guys talk a little bit about offensive speech and how that lays out for us, both in terms of political censorship and in terms of social censure, your two different ways of looking at it.
Well, in some ways, free speech is about offensive speech almost exclusively.
Yeah, it
you
really
know,
is, isn't it?
Otherwise, you don't need any protections.
I know.
Yeah.
People do forget that, right?
You
Yeah.
literally, the only point of talking about free speech is to talk about speech that offends usually a majority.
Yes,
of
that's
people,
right.
Right. Otherwise, we
Right.
don't need any law.
Right. It's a wonderful, I mean, look, I think it's a wonderful protection for minorities. It's one of the things that I think is, well, I guess I'm speaking to the converted here, right? It's one of the greatest things about our Constitution.
Well, it's there's a lot of free speech theory in going back to Mill and Milton,
yeah.
and even Milton earlier, but in the legal in our legal circles, there's a lot of theorizing about what free speech is really about, and in some ways, it's about preserving the possibility of progress, because majorities tend to insulate themselves from change, and if today's majority doesn't, a majority will arise that is effective at insulating itself from change. And one of the only pressure valves that society has when a majority has successfully done that is speech, is the ability to challenge. And that's why it's not surprising at all that majorities tend to try to suppress speech. One of the most famous free speech opinions from the Supreme Court is a dissent written by Oliver Wendell Holmes when he was on the Supreme Court, and he said it would be perfectly natural if you were convinced of your beliefs to sweep away all opposition and
Sure.
to censor speech.
This is human nature.
It's human nature,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
free speech is meant to be a protection against that, a protection against the belief that you're infallible.
Yeah. Isn't it super cool that each of us believe that we're infallible, right? But that each of us are such partial knowers in a certain way that then we need those oppositional opinions from other people so that we can move and develop and grow in our own opinions. It's a wonderful system, a dynamic system that once you recognize it, you go, whoa, look at that work.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I think that if you want to, let's say, be a little fair to the other side of this conversation, because we have 3 free speech activists here,
Yeah.
right? They would say, it's not that hard to identify a category of speech that deeply wounds and has really none of the social value.
Okay, let's
Alex
talk
was
about
just
that.
talking
Yeah.
about, right? And so, let's say speech that just degrades or disparages people on the basis of their religion or their sexual orientation or their race. The problem is, it's pretty hard to come up with a definition of that kind of
Sure.
speech that doesn't include the Bible or the Quran or people's very deeply held religious beliefs. And then, on top of that, is what we might call the decision maker problem. Is that once you have that decision, someone is going to be the one who
of
decides
course.
if it meets that category or if it doesn't meet that
Of
category.
course, yeah.
And it's not going to be a professor of philosophy who's making that decision.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's going to be a sheriff in a small town in Alabama. Sometimes it's going to be a right-wing school board or a left-wing school board that's
a really
making that
good point.
decision. And so, someone is going to say that a T-shirt that says there are only 2 genders is disparaging erasure, is absolutely indefensible on any ground. Someone else is going to say, I think that's a statement of scientific fact, right? And someone is going to say a Confederate flag is a vile symbol of slavery, racism, oppression, and others are going to say, this is my cultural heritage and pride, and the decision makers are going to come to very, very different conclusions about which side of the line this speech can be on. And I think I always try to tell people it's almost the only argument that works is, do you want Donald Trump's appointee to some various position to be the one deciding whether something is hate speech that you think should be banned or political speech that has to be protected?
I have never looked at it like that. That was so valuable. Thank you so much. Can I just give it back to you, then you tell me if I got it right? I saw 3 categories, so I'll tell you what they were. The first one is, we all kind of know what speech we don't want, and so it's a super vague idea. So there's the problem of vagueness there, right?
Yeah.
But we think we are articulating something when in fact it's really vague. Then there's the second stage where you articulate it. Now that's a real problem, right? Where you take this vague idea and you put it into language, because language is always, however much it pretends to be precise, a very difficult thing to actually make precise, right? Chances are you can't take that vague idea and actually shoehorn it into a precise linguistic form, right? So now you've got problem number 2. Now problem number 3 is that you've got actually have human beings terribly fallible of very different persuasions, right, who are going to apply that linguistic form. And they're going to apply it in a million different ways that then are never going to correspond to this vague principle that you had at the beginning. So in conclusion, give up that vague principle, right? Because you're never going to get it implemented. Is that right? No.
I think it's absolutely correct.
Yes.
I was just going to I was going to add one other thing to it. So I unsurprisingly agree with everything Ben said. I would add that one of the other I think principles that a lot of free speech advocates have in mind is that even if we could identify categories of speech that everybody would agree should be off limits, and we could, address the problems Ben pointed out in getting to that point, even then it may be better for society to figure out how to convince people not to hold those beliefs rather than to suppress them through the force of law.
Sure.
For a lot of reasons. One has to do with a word that Ben used earlier, which is tolerance, and the idea that in a plural society we need a system of government and a system of interacting with one another that works for everyone. And if we don't have that, if we have a system that instead declares some people out of the political realm, it banishes them from the political realm because of their views or the words that they use, then that's not going to be a system that everybody is going to sign up for. And it's going to be hard to, I think, maintain a general commitment to that vision of democracy when it tries to exclude certain people, and maybe a significant percentage depending on what these categories are. Another, and this is a theory that some people have called the kind of social barometer theory of the First Amendment or of free speech, is that it's helpful to know where society is. It's helpful to know what views people hold if your goal is to progress, if your goal is to change people's minds, change people's lived experiences. It's good to know where they stand. And if instead we force all of that speech and belief underground,
It just
then
bubbles
we
up.
can't engage with it, right?
Yeah.
Then we get some of the
Yeah.
problems that we've seen, I think, over the last 10, 15 years in this country. So there are a lot of, I think, good reasons to protect even the speech that nearly everybody in this country would say doesn't have any social value. And maybe, even if we could maybe define it in, a narrow way.
Yeah, even if we could, which we probably can't, but even if
Yeah.
we could, right?
Yeah.
When I've thought about this before, I've kind of thought about what ideas are absolutely beyond what you're talking about, or beyond the ability to even be said. And I thought, the only one that I could really think of that nobody argues for anymore is slavery. But if you think about it, 200 years ago, that was a hot topic. People debated it, And as people debated it, people came to the consensus that you're talking about,
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and you have to imagine.
You don't think so?
I know. I think it took a little bit more than words.
Yeah.
In that instance.
Okay, so
Right.
can you talk a little bit
Well,
about
no,
how that works?
I don't. I guess I would say, even if I don't believe that the best arguments will prevail, I still defend free speech.
Right.
And so, was it the speech of abolitionists, or was it the Union Army that ended slavery? It was
I
both.
see your point. Uh-huh.
It was both in that instance. I don't want to put that burden
I
on
see.
our commitment to free expression,
Yeah,
that
I
the
see that
best
point.
ideas will always win out.
That's
They
that's
may
an
not.
obvious point.
They may
Yeah,
not.
thank you for making that.
Yeah.
That was an obvious point. Yeah.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
persistent
thank you.
belief that the truth will always prevail is maybe the best argument that against that empirical claim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rise.
Yeah.
What was it? Mills rise to the top like
Yeah.
cream on milk. I think
Yeah.
that was his phrase, right? And it does it. His argument was it does it.
does.
Yeah.
I think
yeah.
his better argument was, we're only ever justified in believing something if we allow it to be contested.
Yeah.
And in that way, the First Amendment or free speech is the kind of predicate to the scientific method, right? You need to be open to inquiry if you want
Yeah.
to, if you want to feel justified in believing anything in this world. And it's also worth thinking, one thing that I think is important to recognize about free speech, it's not just about society today. It is about society as it changes over time.
Yeah.
And whatever we think today will change in 100 years. So imagine we decided today will be politically off limits, simply incomprehensible, to accept that somebody would believe that slavery is okay. And imagine we set that in stone through law, and there is no longer any conversation around that topic. In 100 years, 50 years, maybe, who knows how long any country is around. In 50 years, 100 years, if people look back and they study this question, and what they see is silence in the record for 100 years because of enforced orthodoxy, that's a recipe, I think, for a revival, of the
I
belief.
think so too. I think
People
so too.
will, they come to view there as being conspiracy theories, like someone is trying to suppress something that
It'll
they didn't.
bubble up.
Yeah.
I agree completely.
Yeah.
Mill did make this really wonderful argument that wasn't just social. He made it for the individual epistemic progress. And if you remember this, he said, you should always listen to the other side. There's only 3 options of things that can happen. The first one is that you realize that you were wrong and they were right. Great, now you're freed from error, right? The second one is that, which is the most common, he said, is that you both sort of compromise. You see some points that I made, I see some points that you made. That's nice, everyone comes out in the winner. He goes, the third one, which is that you walk away thinking that you were right and the other person is wrong, that's usually the reason for censorship, because even that one's good. Because in that one, you were forced to articulate your arguments in ways that you wouldn't otherwise, because all of our beliefs just remain silent in our head. And he says, remain in an encrusted brain, which is
I think today's progressives would say there's a fourth thing that could happen.
Tell me.
Right, or today's college students would say, I was harmed.
Okay, let's talk about
The
that.
thing you said caused me injury.
Yeah.
And that's an injury that I shouldn't have to suffer. Part of my answer to that is don't listen. Right? You're actually not being compelled to listen, and you're trying to shut down the speaker is not fundamentally a way to protect yourself from harm, but to prevent other people from hearing what this person has to say, and that's why it's not acceptable. I think you can acknowledge that words actually can wound and cause harm, and I think saying they don't, you're weak, toughen up, get a thicker skin, is not an effective way of talking to people. I think what you can say is, if you believe that this speech is causing you harm, then don't go and hear it. Now, that itself is an incomplete argument as well, because the thing about a college campus is that you actually are. Think about the college campuses right now, where there are massive protests and counter-protests about what's happening, the tragedy that's happening in Israel and Palestine.
Yeah.
There isn't really a way to avoid hearing those kinds of views. So I think we do need to also acknowledge and grapple with the argument that people believe they're being injured by the speech. And I wonder where you want to go with that.
I mean, I think it's a great point. We protect speech in spite of the costs, the harms it can cause. Words are powerful. I think it would be a strange defense of free speech to say, don't worry about the offensive stuff because words are powerless. It's the opposite. Words are very powerful. They motivate people to action. They can inspire movements, and they can cause your blood level to rise. They can do all of these things, and we protect it, notwithstanding those costs, because of the risks of for a variety of reasons, the ones we've talked about. But I think that's an important recognition, and one criticism that you'll sometimes see of free speech advocates is that they pretend that those costs aren't real. And I think it's important as a free speech advocate to identify, those costs and to come up with an explanation of why society ought to tolerate the harm caused by somebody going around and denying the existence of people, or of, denigrating somebody on the basis of, characteristics that we think ought to be, ought not to be the basis of criticism. And that's an important role, I think, of a free speech advocate, is to identify the costs and to be, wide-eyed about them.
And so even though there are costs, you do it anyway.
Yes.
Is that this final conclusion?
That's
But I don't know.
I think that's right. Now, I mean, you could you could dig a little deeper and you could get into a taxonomy of costs, and there are times where harms from speech are not tolerated by free speech laws. So that an example
Libel.
of that would be libel would be an example of that, or true threats, where I threaten you in a way where you reasonably believe that I'm going to cause you physical harm. That's words,
Right.
but we don't.
But those
protect
things have gone into physical harm, both of those. Isn't that the
No,
reason?
I'm threatening physical harm.
But
yes.
it will, it's
or,
the
or
first.
even, or harassment, right?
Yeah,
where I call you and say, let's have coffee, and you say no, and then I call you 100 times in the middle of the night and say, let's have coffee. Just words, both times,
Yeah.
but we're going to say, you know what, those words have created a real world harm that we're not going to accept. But if the harm is, I'm offended because of the content of that speech, and that's it.
Yeah.
Just it's the content of that. Then I think that the costs of trying to kind of respect that harm
Are too high.
are way too high.
This is, maybe you guys don't want to go here, but I've wondered about this all my life, so maybe you can answer this question. What you were discussing right there, like, you know, I think that, maybe I'm wrong again, but the overall line with speech is that when it crosses over into violence, into physical harm, it's definitely illegal, right? I can't conspire to kill you, right? I can't do anything like that. But
Well,
then,
you also can't conspire to fix prices using words.
That's
we would
true.
say that's conduct, right? But
Yeah.
so it's not only on. So if your words are integral to some kind of criminal offense, right? Then there are other exceptions. In general, the question you're asking is, when are you going to hold me responsible
Yeah.
for the actions of someone else?
Yeah, yeah,
And that
yeah.
you know, violence seems to be the kind of right category for that.
right.
Yeah.
So there's a certain amount, like you were giving the example of calling 100 times at night. There's no actual physical harm there, but it's enough of a psychological harm that we then criminalize it, right? So do you know where that line is?
The doctrinal answer we have, the answer we have from the Supreme Court is really unsatisfying if what you're looking for is some principled explanation. The Supreme Court has said there are a short list of categories of speech that are beyond the protection of the First Amendment, and they include, the ones we've talked about: obscenity, defamation, fighting words, true threats, incitement to violence, and harassment. And that's basically the list. And the court has said we're not going to expand that list. And there, some people have tried to account for that list on the basis of the distinction you were alluding to earlier, the distinction between speech and conduct. I find that to be helpful for some categories, but generally an unsatisfying explanation, because sometimes it really is just speech, and pretending that its conduct is not.
Is not useful?
Defamation would be a good example of that, right?
Yeah.
Where, we're talking about words that harm your reputation, but I don't think you can say that's violence or that's conduct.
I thought the
Right.
original, maybe I don't understand this, but I thought the original reason for defamation being criminalized was that it made it impossible for you to have an actual profession and support yourself, so that you were then suffering physical harm in the end, no?
Well, it's a broad definition of physical harm.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Yeah.
If that's the definition,
Yeah, that's
that
what I
may be.
thought
That
it was,
may be, yeah.
But so, it is a funny, like, hate speech is a funny in-between world then. Can you elaborate on a little bit about, like, in other words, I take it that you think that we ought to be able to tolerate at least a certain amount of hate speech, right, in the furtherance of having a kind of democracy where speech is actually exchanged between people.
I mean, that's one
Right.
part of it, and the other part of it is that there's no definition of hate speech that won't
That's the other
also
one.
encompass speech that many people think is valuable. And
Right.
that will be very contested.
That was the
And
vague
this is-
into the
This is
specific
one where we
problem,
don't have
yeah.
to be only philosophical, because we can look at other democracies that draw the line in another place. Right? So
Yeah.
Canada,
Canada's
or
different.
France, or Germany, these are places that actually say, we think hate speech is not something that is deserving of protection. And you can look at the kinds of cases that get prosecuted. And the reason why I brought up religion before is that those are very typical cases where someone who is adhering to what was once a mainstream but now seems extreme, religious ideology runs afoul of the new thinking about what's hateful, because religions are extremely intolerant.
Yeah, it's the nature
and their
of them.
rhetoric is quite violent.
Yeah.
Right. So take a hate speech law in any country and run it up against some of the things that you're going to find in the Old Testament, And you'll find it actually is pretty hard to do in practice.
Yeah,
Right.
I think that's exactly right. That's kind of this problem that you were talking about before. You have a great idea, but putting it into practice just becomes almost impossible, right? Yeah.
It's going to sweep up things. You're going to say, that's not what we meant.
Right.
That's not what we meant. We meant Nazis, not Leviticus.
Yeah, right.
Right.
I mean, I think one thing that one thing that I think the free speech community is missing is a principled accounting of why the exceptions that we have for the First Amendment protections are the right ones or the necessary ones for a democracy. Because, I think democracies could reasonably draw the lines in slightly different places.
And they do.
And they do. And I don't think anybody would argue that Germany is fundamentally undemocratic because it has decided on the basis of its very different history than ours.
No speech about the Holocaust.
Right, that Holocaust
Yeah.
denialism is going to be criminal.
Yeah.
I don't think it's fundamentally undemocratic. I think we could still make arguments about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing,
Or whether it's achieving what they think it's going to achieve when
Yeah.
our
Yeah.
far-right parties are doing better now than they were before.
Right,
Right.
and masking their anti-Semitism and
Yeah.
denialism.
Yeah.
But there isn't some principled explanation for why the lines that we have drawn in our First Amendment, case law are the necessary ones, or the ones that flow out of some, interesting theory of democracy. They're just the ones that our Supreme Court has drawn. And I
Yeah.
think you can come up with great explanations for most of them. Some of them are a little bit harder.
Ultimately, where I think a lot of free speech advocates come down is just on the side of a mistrust of powerful government decision makers.
Yeah, which is, I think,
Right.
completely correct.
And it's an instrumental
Yeah.
argument, I think a little bit more than a normative argument, although it has
You
elements
think?
of both.
Really?
It has elements of, I think the way that we use it, which is, would you really want that person deciding? Not, it's an invalid question.
Yeah.
But, I think it almost concedes that if there were an ideal platonic decision maker, it would be okay. But since there never will be one, then don't accept this.
Well,
Yeah.
we accept
Right.
decision makers in other contexts where we have other goals.
Right.
When you're teaching a class, the subject matter of the conversation is limited. You decide who speaks when and for how long. You assign
Although
grades.
you haven't seen those classes, they're pretty chaotic.
Okay. Maybe not the
Trust me.
philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah.
You assign grades on the basis of speech,
Yeah.
and we've decided societally that this is the way to advance very important pedagogical goals. Right. That's the way you serve those pedagogical interests, not through the completely free give and take in ordinary public discourse. And there are plenty of contexts where we have decided that what the First Amendment requires of the government in public spaces is not what a commitment to free speech requires in any particular space.
Yeah.
Even
think
in
we've-
government, I would say. So
Yeah.
we misinformation, disinformation has become a very hot topic in free speech law.
Yeah.
Right? There's the people who really believe that this is the great threat to democracy, and our First Amendment is making it impossible to do anything about this. And they say, look, we actually do allow the government to regulate misinformation, right? We can say you can't lie about what your product will do.
I was gonna say,
you
yeah.
can't make medical claims that are unsupported by science,
Yeah.
and we have federal agencies that are deciding whether
Yeah.
things are true or
But those are
false.
tied to products always,
It's not
right?
just. I think it's not just that they're
Or
tied to products. I
elections.
think the better.
Yeah.
I think the better distinction is, we don't have any reason to think that those decision makers will have an improper motivation or a partisan motivation when they're protecting consumers from depredations of avaricious corporations. Whereas if you're saying we want the government to decide which political ads are true or false, the decision maker is always going to be partisan and is
That's a good
always going to
point.
be motivated and is always
Yeah.
right. So there's no way to run a system like that where you can have a fundamentally neutral decision maker. Even our judges are members of political parties and are appointed by people, and so these are just fundamentally different kinds of decisions that are being made. And I say to people, what's an example of political misinformation that you think ought to be regulated?
Yeah.
Usually they'll say, the big lie that Trump won the 2020 election. I say, well, how do you know that that's a lie? We know. The courts decided. And I said, I actually still believe that Al Gore won the 2000 election.
Yeah.
But the court said that he didn't. So do
Right.
you think that I
Right.
should not be allowed to say that online? Do you think I shouldn't be able to say that in a political ad?
Yeah.
And if you think I should be able to say that, then how do you square that with preventing people from promoting the big lie about Trump? And
Yeah.
and you realize this is not easy to do, right?
Yeah, it's the same difficulty talking about before. You know,
Yeah.
everyone has like
Yeah.
this vague concept, you know, but the vague concept is a mirroring of their notion of what should be going on,
Yeah.
right? But then in order to put that into language that actually captures what they think should be going on, right? The broad net captures everything else.
Pretty hard.
Yeah.
It's pretty hard. It's really hard.
And
yeah.
the person who's going to be enforcing that
The
is
person is
only
gonna be
half the
enforcing
time
it.
going to be someone you trust.
Yeah, yeah, the enforcer issue that you brought up before,
Yeah.
Ben, I think is like so important, you know, and I think that's a really good argument for a smaller government involvement.
Yeah.
You know, people a lot of times think that if only their laws were enforced, it would be a great government, but they don't understand that a couple years later, the government's gonna change, and it's gonna be other people enforcing the law quite differently.
And
you know?
even at the same time in different
Yeah.
parts of the country.
Yeah.
Right? I say you have the San Francisco School
Yeah.
Board and you have a rural Alabama school board.
Yeah,
You can give them the same language, and I guarantee you they're going to put things right on different sides of the line. You know, we've heard politicians saying that the most hateful organizations in America are BLM and the ACLU.
yeah, right, that's
Right,
hate speech.
right.
Right, I know.
Right,
Right, and there's probably
Yeah.
an argument somewhere there
Yeah.
for it. So we take that problem out of the legal domain and put it into the social domain where it really belongs. Is that correct?
I think that's the alternative for most of these kinds of questions,
Yeah.
is we force people to deal with them through ordinary political discourse, and don't assign the government the power of saying yes or no when it comes to people's political
Yeah.
beliefs. You know, one of the this is maybe a little bit of a diversion, but just thinking through something Ben was saying, one of the really interesting challenges right now in the First Amendment is that even the boundaries of the First Amendment are deeply contested. You know, what is the freedom of speech? It turns out the Constitution doesn't really answer that question for us. It uses that phrase, it's not really defined. And now we live in an economy where the main currency is data. Ones and zeros, people's private data collected by social media companies, all of the advertising ecosystem that surrounds the collection of that data, and figuring out the role that the First Amendment has in regulation relating to an economy that is largely driven by what some people claim is just speech, these ones and zeros, turns out to be really challenging. You earlier said a second ago, maybe the answer is smaller government. I think that's true in some domains. It's harder to figure out what the right role, what the right principle is of free speech and the government's regulatory authority when it comes to, for example, privacy laws. Privacy laws are anti-speech laws in a way. Privacy law, if you think about it, at its basic concept is a law that says you cannot take this information or you cannot use it in a specific way. Mm-hmm. At that level of generality, a privacy law is an anti-speech law. Now, I happen to think reasonable privacy laws are constitutional, but coming up with a good explanation of why it's not, not a violation of the First Amendment can be challenging.
Yeah.
And
Who owns what speech?
right.
Yeah.
Right. When Facebook
Yeah.
monitors your usage of its
Yeah.
platform, or when it collects data
ChatGPT
yeah.
owns everything, actually.
Now, right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
When OpenAI
Yeah.
scrapes the internet for
Yeah.
everything,
Yeah.
what are the rights of people whose data is swept up in that? And the right to be forgotten, which we talked about a minute ago, is, instead of a bad answer to a real problem, but there are lots of privacy laws being enacted now that are attempting to get at either the business model of social media or the privacy harms of social media. And figuring out where the right lines are is,
Yeah.
is really challenging, it turns out.
We've kind of ended this where we started, which is internet stuff.
Yeah.
Right? Can I ask you one last question about that? This is sort of a very open-ended one.
Yeah.
With students, right, they're always complaining to me, this is privately, about the internet. They feel like the internet has ruined everything, and which is a really interesting
I'm
thing
really glad to
hear.
hear that.
Yeah.
I know, I thought
That's
you
very
might be.
cheering.
That's
But,
heartening.
well,
Yeah.
I know, but it's very depressing for them because they kind of feel, I get this, it's hard to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, right? But they seem to feel overwhelmed and trapped at the same time, and then at the same time feel like all the opportunities in the world are laid before them. And so, I don't know if that's a fair psychological story there, but what's the solution to because I feel like the internet is the source, maybe I'm not right, I feel like the internet is the source of all of our speech problems that are going on right now.
So I don't know what the right answer to this question is. I'll say two things. One is that regulation will play some role in what our digital information environment looks like in the future. The role it plays will depend in large part on the country that you're in. The European Union is regulating
Yes.
quickly and
Yes.
extensively. The United States, we haven't regulated that much. There are some states that are passing laws, there are federal bills being considered, but there hasn't been that much regulation. There will be some regulation that will change the internet, change social media somewhat. But the thing that gives me the most hope is that the next generation will forge a different relationship with the internet than our generation developed, not having grown up with the internet, but then having to learn it early on. And that's encouraging to me because the First Amendment, like I said before, I think it protects the opportunity to progress. But the ultimate engine of change sometimes is just the death of the current generation.
I think that's really true.
And the next generation will have a different relationship
Yeah, I
with
think that's
devices and the internet, and I'm excited to see what that looks
They're
like.
struggling, I think,
They're
right now.
struggling, but they'll figure it out.
The status quo does feel dystopian.
It does, right now.
My 3-year-old daughter has a book in which unicorns are either groovy corns because they dance or gloomy corns because they stare into a phone all the time. It's a wonderful sort of way of
People are starting to realize this.
dividing it, but if you had said when we were children that in our lifetimes people were going to be getting all of their news, information, social interaction, entertainment through something that they were staring at in their hand, it really would have felt like dark science fiction.
Yeah.
And it does not only strike me as oppressive when I see it in a library, but even in my own life. I feel both the allure of it and the trap, and it's a collective action problem.
It's a collective action
problem. I really
problem.
wish if somehow smartphones were banned, my life would be better. But if they're not banned, I need one, right? In order to get by. So I think I couldn't say better than Alex. I think the real hope is that and the next generation will collectively say we can't live this way and come up with something that is, and let's hope that it's more humane and not more dystopian.
I think I've often been accused of being too optimistic, so I'm going to give you something that might be too optimistic, and you'll forgive me beforehand, right? I see students, right, young people, and even younger, starting to kind of realize that they have to limit that themselves, and that it's both addictive and depressing at the same time, right? At the same time, right, I think that what it has done is bring into society in like boldface our tendency to want to shut each other down and to not listen to each other and to put people into trenches that then we hate the other side. And so I think that there's probably going to be some concerted effort on everybody's part to systematically learn to listen a little bit better to the other side and to not be so closed-minded. I hope too that the closed-mindedness that we're all struggling with right now is going to be seen to be the problem, right? And that the internet is like the delivery packet for that problem, and that everybody's going to pull back a little bit from both of those things. And so that's my optimistic flag I plant.
+1. I hope.
Yeah.
I don't know whether this is right, but when you look out at the kind of hand-wringing, and not just hand-wringing, but the genuine panic, about the current state of public discourse and the way that people get their information, I hope that most of the moral panic is being felt by people over the age of 25, and that people under the age of 25 are instead thinking, to themselves, how do we do it differently?
I think that's
because they look at us, they look at
yeah.
the rest of us, and they say, we're not doing it the way they did it.
Yeah.
And I think every generation probably does that. I remember when I was, younger, I would look at people who are older and I think they're not doing it the right way. And
Bunch of idiots. Why are they so stupid?
People get set in their ways,
Yeah.
and that I think the ultimate engine of change is, life expectancy.
Yeah, I know. Well, yeah, now that we have these octogenarians running for president, I guess we really do moan that, right?
Maybe the next election.
Maybe the next election, right? There's always hope for the future. Listen, I want to thank both of you very much for coming. It was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you for having us. This
Thank
was
you.
great.
Thanks.
Bye. It was